Hey everyone, welcome back to episode number 3 of This is Tech Talks, and this is season 4. And today we have a very good friend of mine who made me walk 20 minutes, 20 kilometers actually in San Francisco, Elio with us. And he likes to walk, so he makes everyone walk.
That's
But,
actually not true. I don't like to walk, not at all.
so you hate me probably, or you.
But if you're in a city, you actually need to walk because then you see things.
It was too much, 20 kilometers. That was like 2 years ago.
Yeah, indeed. It was a pretty nice long walk. People complained, but okay.
So everyone left. We had Italian mafias, Spanish mafias. They all left. Just two Indians who were there. And then we will be talking about building an VS Code extension, which is a really good topic. I mean, Elio has been working on a lot of extensions, and one of them is Front Matter CMS. I'm sure most of you might be using it. I do use it a lot. Whenever I try to publish some blogs on my portfolio, that's where I go to. I just use Front Matter CMS. And we have our co-host, Sonu, with us. Hey, Sonu, how are you?
Hey Santosh. Hey Elio. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I'm doing good. How are you guys?
Not
nice.
bad. First
Great to be
day
here.
of the week. So no, you have used any VS Code extension, or you have built any VS Code extension?
Yeah, I've used the standard ones to be honest. NX, Prettier, ESLint, things like that. Always wondered how to create one. Always wanted to write one, but never had the time. So I'm looking forward to Elias's experience here.
That's great. Even like I have been only on that side where I have used it a lot, but never created one. Same excuse as Sonu gave. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get started, right? I mean, of course, the one term which comes often is extension, right? And it's not like only VS Code has extension. If you go to any product, they offer extensions, some kind of extensions, right? If you go to GitHub, now GitHub has extensions. If you go to like tools like the WebStorm or IntelliJ, they also have a huge ecosystem of extensions. Visual Studio, for example, right? They might have huge ecosystem extension as well. So what do you mean by extensions?
Extensions can be seen as some sort of plugins making your tool richer. So there's always like the default configuration or the default basic things that your application is going to come with, but you don't always know the needs of your clients, customers, users. So what if the users can just build things so that the experiences can be made to what they need to use during their job or during their daily life. So that's basically what extensions are all about. You create something that makes your life easier into using another tool, like for instance, Angular or React and Vue. All these tools or frameworks, they have their own extensions for IntelliSense, for snippets, and so on. So making your experience a lot better when working in your editor.
So one follow-up question on the same topic, right? So of course, like everyone has extension. What's different about VS Code extension ecosystems?
Of course, it depends on the tool you're going to create extensions for. But most of the time, I say that you can see an extension as working with a backend and a frontend, where in VS Code, the extension is written against the extension host. I sometimes say that's what you can see as your backend layer. And then you have a front end that you can also create, and that's a web view where you have total control over the HTML that you are going to render. So you can create a whole web experience in VS Code by just creating a front end and talking with your backend engine as well.
Yeah, so this front end obviously lives on the user's system, right? And the back end, I assume it can live anywhere, right? It can live on the local host and it can live on the cloud, right?
The backend is also on the user's machine. So it's the extension nodes. It's closer to Visual Studio Code, where actually you can have the web view. It's basically just an iframe where you link to either a local file, local HTML, or you can also use an online version of your JavaScript files or HTML files or so on. I wouldn't recommend it because that means that you always need to rely on the internet in order to load your web view. So it's better to have it locally as well. But your extension, it's always going to be packaged as it's a zip file just called VSIX. That is going to be installed on your machine in your extension folder. And this is also what you can publish and carry on to other devices. So it's always going to be installed on your local machine or in the web, for instance, on vscode.dev or on GitHub. There's also the VS Code editor that you can use there. You can also install extensions, but then they need to be web extension enabled. So not everything can be used in the web.
Okay. So I think we got a little bit of a glimpse of the basic architecture, right? So can you talk a little bit more about this? Can you maybe walk us through a basic, architecture of creating a VS Code extension?
Yeah, sure. So if you're going to start with creating VS Code extensions, Microsoft has a couple of tools available for that. First of all, you need to scaffold a new project. And then we are going back to the old days of project scaffolding. Or what I mean by that is they are still using a tool called Yeoman. So for the older kids, I've been using Yeoman for quite a while. And for Visual Studio Code extensions, that's still the tool that they need to use. But basically, it's just a template generator, and it will ask you a couple of questions. So you need to install generator code and Yeoman, and then you do Yo code, and it will ask you a couple of questions. The first question that it will ask you is, what type of project do you want to create? Do you want to create a new extension? Basically, a new extension is the broadest thing that you can create. It gives you just a TypeScript or JavaScript file, depending on what you want to create there. But with that, you can create anything. But there are other options like a color scheme, language support for a specific new framework that you want to create, language support like Angular and Vue and so on. They have language support. These are the extensions that are being created. Key maps, snippets, I think, is another thing of them. And then, I cannot remember which one. There is more notebooks. So if you are going to choose all the other options, it's not that you pick one that you cannot create the other one. It just comes with a pre-configuration that you can easily start with. Most of the time, I start with a new extension, and then it will ask you, what is the name of your extension? Do you want to do bundling? And these days, do you want to do bundling with ESBuild, Webpack, or no bundling at all? That's another option. And then, it's just a Node projects where you start working with Node and the VS Code APIs. So it has an activate and a deactivate feature. And that's where you start writing your things. And then it's up to you what it's going to be. That said, then the next thing, when you scaffolded that project, then it's up to you what you're going to write there. And let's say the default one is an hello world, like in every application. And it's going to say, hey, there's a pop-up message or an information message you're going to show. That's done with a command. And that's also how you work with VS Code. So most of the time, you're going to trigger things with a command, depending on what kind of an extension you're going to create. In the language support, you're not doing that with a command because it's automatically going to do that. But if you're going to say, hey, there's one that I use very often, it's going from JSON over to a TypeScript declaration file. So then you have the interfaces of your JSON file. Then you do a command JSON to TypeScript, and it picks it from a clipboard and it pastes the interfaces. So that's where you're going to say, hey, I want to register a new command. And this is the name of the command. Whenever your user is running this command, it's going to execute it. All of these commands and functionalities are going to be added in the package.json file. So that way you have a declaration file of what is available within your extension. If you ever go to Visual Studio Code and open an extension in the extension panel, there you can also see what things are available in your extension, like commands, settings, and so on. This is all coming from the package.json file. So I mentioned settings. That's also something you can interact with. So if you want to update some particular things inside your extension, let's say I don't want to use feature X or I want to enable some kind of feature, that's also where you can have these settings, and that nicely integrates with the VS Code UI or inside the JSON file where you get full IntelliSense as well.
So one follow-up question, Singh. As you mentioned, like of course there are some VS Code APIs as well, right? So this VS Code APIs are like created by the VS Code team, or it's a community-driven project where anyone can contribute as well.
No, they are driven by the VS Code team. So most of the time you just follow up with the insider builds, because there you have the APIs available much quicker than in the main stable build, which is normal. Sometimes they release like snippets of experimental APIs, which are then already available within the insider build, but they are not yet published, so that you can just put them inside your extension, already start using them. And then the moment they release the first version where it's actually built in, then you can start using that. But it's all driven by VS Code or by the VS Code team.
Okay. But as a developer, we can request for some APIs, right? I mean, if there is a need, maybe. But it will be always built by the VS Code team. It's not like someone from outside
Correct.
can. Okay.
No. And they are pretty clear on that as well. Like you first need to open an issue, and then you will get an answer if they are going to work on it or not. So it's not that you can create it. There's like one API that I really want to have. It's like a gets a context API. So there's a context within Visual Studio Code to know what kind of panel is open, to know if the output panel is open or not. These things, you can set a context. That's one thing that you can do from within an extension, but you cannot read the context, unfortunately. There's a whole thread open. I think there's a person that already did a pull request a couple of years ago where they created the get context API implementation, but it was not approved by the VS Code team. So, or at least I've seen something like that. So the team will follow up with it, and they will tell if it's going to come or not. So if there are things missing, submit an issue and wait until the team responds. Don't start working on it yet, I would say.
Maybe this is probably security concern as well, right? Like people may just write anything or misuse the APIs, which is a bigger concern. That's good. And about the SDKs, is it like available in JavaScript, TypeScript, or any other languages?
For the extensions, you're building your extensions with JavaScript or TypeScript. But then it also depends a little bit on the rest on what you're going to create. Like a color scheme is not JavaScript or TypeScript. That's purely done in JSON. So key maps and code snippets, that's also done in JSON. So, but the main extensions are always going to be built in TypeScript or JavaScript.
You mentioned there is a Yeoman generator, right? So just share the link with us where people can get the Yeoman generator, so we can add it in our notes as well.
Yeah, is there anything that's besides Yeoman you need to start developing, like any other resources or tools that could eventually help you?
The one tool that you really need, besides Yeoman and Code and Node, because you need to install it locally, is Visual Studio Code, of course. Because if you don't have Visual Studio Code, you cannot create extensions. So that's the one tool that you really need. There's also another tool which got renamed, I think, beginning of last year, which is the VSCE, and now at vscode/VSCE. That's the Visual Studio Code Extension Manager. Basically, that's a tool that you need to package your project and to publish the extension to the marketplace. But then that's when your extension is already complete for download or for usage by other people. So it's not that you always need to publish your extension to the marketplace. In my previous companies, I've built a couple of extensions that were never released to the marketplace because it was only going to be used within our team. So that can also be the case, that you just want to use it within your own team. Let's say that you have a service within your team that you just want to retrieve information from during the development process. That's also something you can do. And then you just publish, or you share the VSIX file and then others of your team can just install it and start using it.
So one question here. So let's say if I have to publish my VS Code extension, does it need to be approved by VS Code team, or I can just publish it?
No, it doesn't need to be approved by the Visual Studio Code team. The only thing that you need is an account, a Microsoft account. In the Microsoft account, once you have that, I think you go to Azure DevOps. In Azure DevOps, you create a personal access token. The personal access token needs to have approval for publishing to the marketplace and for reading the marketplace. That's the only thing that is needed there. So you have your personal access token with the publish command of the VSCE tool. You just paste it in, and then you can publish it. The first time it takes, I think, 5 to 10 minutes before it's there. And then the next time it's pretty fast. There's nobody actually checking. There's a link on the website. There's a link within Visual Studio Code. So report issues or report things that are not clear, or if you see some abuse in the projects, you can just reach out, and they are pretty fast in responding. Because I once had something that was not clear enough explained within my documentation. And Microsoft quickly reached out, and I had a time frame of, I think it was 12 hours, 24 hours to respond to the message to make that clearer for the end users. It was not business critical or something, so that wasn't good. Could be that if it's more business critical, that they will be giving you a shorter time frame. But at least for me, it was like 24 hours and everything was cleared out.
So question around security. So as a user, should I be really careful playing with the new extensions on the marketplace?
I always recommend people to check dependencies of what they are installing, like NPM. You can either type blindfolded and then say, okay, enter, I'm not sure what I'm installing. That's the nice thing about open source, at least. Most of these extensions are open source, so you can actually go and check out the sources, what it's actually doing. If you want, you can download the sources, run it locally, see how it interacts and so on. Is everyone going to do it? No. But if there's like a really good user base and the reviews are good and you think, okay, this can be trusted, then for sure, go ahead. If you think it's sketchy, I would say go and check on the sources first. There are a couple of these sketchy ones where people don't share their sources, and these are the ones I would never install because I'm not sure what's going on there. So then, yeah, probably they have something to hide, I would always think by myself. So yeah, just be careful on what you install there.
So is it possible to publish an extension without exposing the code base?
Yeah, indeed. You don't need to do that. There's a couple of them out there, bigger ones as well. So you always download the sources, but the sources are then bundled, wrapped. You want to unpack everything and then unminify things or making it beautiful and stuff. Yeah, you can, of course. And there's AI these days. You can also ask AI to make it humanly understandable. Actually, I did it, not for an extension, but a couple of months ago, there was we had a problem with some tool. There was a bug in it and we didn't find it. But then you have minified code I cannot read that. So I just pasted the code snippet within ChatGPT and it said, make it humanly understandable again. And actually it came up with variable names and stuff. And I was like, okay, this is what's happening. Okay, here's the bug. And then I could report the bug back because I could understand and see what was actually going on. So that works as well.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about performance and scalability challenges. Have you encountered any of those? How did you address them?
Yeah, so as Santosh mentioned in the beginning, one of my extensions, which is a little bit special, is a CMS called Front Matter CMS. It's a CMS within Visual Studio Code. One of the reasons why I wanted to have a CMS in Visual Studio Code is because I love working in Visual Studio Code. I don't like context switching. So the more I can have within my editor, because I'm a developer, I'm living there, it's optimal. Now, one of these things that I encountered, it was like a couple of years ago, things became slower. due to caching. Normally caching would be faster, but was actually making things slower. The reason was there's a couple of ways of caching inside Visual Studio Code. So you have state management. So if you close Visual Studio Code and you open it again, that you can still work with the same state. And there's like memento state, I think Visual Studio Code is using. But what I didn't know back then was that it's only good if you use it for a certain amount of kilobytes, megabytes. Now, if you're working with a CMS and with a lot of files, a lot of blog posts, a lot of media files, and so on, the cache was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So there was a lot of data, and Memento was not catching up with it. And that was like, I was hitting some limits. At some points, they started to show like, this is not good that you use state for this because it's bigger than X amount of megabytes. So the way to improve it was just use state management based on file storage. So that's also something they have built in. So you just tell, okay, you have like a workspace state or a global state, which is in something like in memory, but you can also have it on file. So, and it improved it a lot. So there was a lot and more performance there. One of the issues I think that I had was I updated a dependency called glop, and going from, let's say, version 2 to version 4, there was a breaking change, but my code was still compiling. So everything was nice. So I thought, okay, everything is good. But apparently on Windows, and I'm a Mac user, so I have a Windows device here. So here and now and then I need to test it as well. On Windows, it was becoming very slow. And the reason was the paths within Visual Studio Code. So a Windows path is not the same as a Mac path or as a Linux path. Yeah, so that was one of these issues that I didn't see. So if you want to have compatibility between all the 3 operating systems, you need to parse your paths. So from backslashes to forward slashes and so on, to always make sure that it's the same path. For Windows, it's not that nice because sometimes you receive backward slashes, sometimes you receive forward slashes. So I got some utility classes now that I just flip it around so that I always know, okay, all my slashes are this way. So if I want to compare paths, that I know everything is in the same way. So paths is a thing.
VS Code gives you also the information about on which OS VS Code is running?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you have your information on where your extension is hosted from. So what's the location of your extension? You have a storage location for your extension, and then you know in which path or in which workspace they call it. So where your project is actually located, then you know the path of your file that you have opened and so on.
So one question about compatibility, right? Of course, when you rely on an API, like as we mentioned, VS Code, which is not visible to you, but being maintained by others. So how do you maintain the compatibility when VS Code is actually upgrading or updating the APIs?
One of these examples, or one of the good examples, is Copilot. A couple of months ago, they released Copilot, or the ability that you can interact with Copilot from your extension. It was available for a longer time in the insider build, but then the APIs were just there, but they didn't do anything within the stable build. So what you need to do whenever you're going to build an extension is you need to tell your extension which version of Visual Studio Code APIs you want to use. So Visual Studio Code, not sure which version is out there right now, and let's check. So it's right now for me version 1.96.4. If you want to build against this version inside your package.json file, you will tell engine Visual Studio Code version 1.96.4. So that means whenever you're going to install the extension, you cannot do it on a lower version than that version. So if you try to install it on an older version of Visual Studio Code, it will just say, sorry, I cannot install it because it requires this. Then from that version onwards, Visual Studio should support this or keep on supporting it until they put something in deprecation. But I never seen anything in deprecation yet.
Interesting. So you have seen any scenario where they release something and then it broke your extension because they have now incompatible APIs?
No, like Front Matter CMS has been running for a long time, I think, on version 1.50. And I recently updated it to the version where it supports GitHub Copilot. So I bumped it from version 1.50 to 1.80 or something. So that was a huge version bump. Everything kept on working. There was no difference. And even for version 1.80, version 1.50 was still working because the APIs didn't change.
And do they do like VS Code inform if they are breaking any APIs or introducing any breaking changes?
Yeah, but they are using SEM versioning. So at least with SEM versioning, if they bump it to version 2, then things should start, or then we expect that things start breaking. But until now, they have been following that very carefully. Every update, if you open Visual Studio Code and you have an update, you get a markdown file that you can read through. All of the changes are there. And I think at the bottom, most of the time, there's like the contributors, but right above, there's most of the time the extensions changes. So if there's new extension changes, they will also be mentioned in there. So for me, that's always a thing where I scan what can I use for my extensions to make them better or come up with new ideas.
Let's talk a bit about, open source, since most of these extensions, I think, are open source, or I assume they are. What role do you think it has played in that, in the growth of Visual Studio extensions and the growth of open source and all of that?
Yeah, I think open source is one of the key players in the success, I think, for Visual Studio Code. That's why a lot of people start using that. And it's an open platform. So all of these extensions, or most of the extensions, people can just contribute to them to make them better and so on. So for me, that was also an inspiration to actually start working on it. I've been doing open source for a longer time than that. That was for me like, hey, this is actually the first editor that makes it so easy for me to build my own experiences within the editor to make my life a lot better. So open source is then nice to build, get feedback, work with others. And yeah, I always say that development is a hobby of mine. So working together with a couple of people and getting inspiration or being inspired by others, yeah, that's one of the remarkable things about open source, I think. In many cases, what I do is I typically go to the VS Code marketplace or to other tools if it hasn't anything to do with Visual Studio Code, and then read some code, see how other people are doing it, trying to fork it, play with it, see what I can do and learn from people, because that's also what is good about open source. You learn what others are writing, and with that you can teach yourself into either better writing, new ways of working, new frameworks, and so on. So always nice.
That's true. That's how we really developers, I think, looking at other people's code.
True. Some people call it art. Coding is a bit of art if you have a lot of creativity. Now, I don't like to read all of the code. There are certain languages that I don't really like, but let's not talk about that.
Yeah, I think the end of our podcast. I mean, it was fun talking about VS Code extension because, as Sonu also mentioned, like I want to do it as well, but the only problem is time, right? And probably after this podcast, maybe I'll try to find that time and see like how I can probably build something around VS Code extension.
Yeah, happy to hear what you're going to build. It's a fun thing. So, and if you already know how to work with either backend projects or front-end projects or full stack, Visual Studio Code is not so different when you're going to build extensions. So all of the skills that you already have for the other web projects, you can just reuse them within Visual Studio Code for building these extensions. So you're up and running quite fast.
Do you recommend any contents or any blog posts or videos in case someone wants to get started with?
I would mostly recommend the documentation from Visual Studio Code. They're quite up to date. And for every API, they have a sample, or for most of them, they have a sample, and they're also mentioned within the documentation. Even if they create a new extension API, they also make a sample available for you to try out. So that way, it's so easy to learn on, what can you do with this kind of an API? So there's a whole sample repository there as well. That's mostly it. I blog about a couple of things on things that I was missing, like the authentication provider and stuff, because that was not clear. But I think most of the information is already inside the documentation and inside the samples. That's where I get my sources from.
So we generally ask our guests to promote anything on our channel. So if you have anything to promote, go ahead and do that.
Yeah, so one of these things is Front Matter CMS. So if you have a website, you're using static site generator like Astro, Hugo, and so on, definitely try out Front Matter CMS. Then you can manage all of your content of the website within Visual Studio Code. There's a new extension, or it's not that new anymore. It's already a year old. But I love to do presentations as well. And I love to do live coding demos. But one of these things, when you're doing a live coding demo, it's like one thing to prepare your session. And if you do that session a couple of times throughout the year at multiple locations, you always have to think, how did I do it? How do I start from scratch? How do I go from one step to the other? So I think it was in 2023, a guy came up to me and he said like, hey, have you ever tried Code Tour? Which is not really a tool for presentations, but you can actually go step by step through your code by making a guide. I said, yeah, I've used it, but only for making people aware of my project and how it works and so on. I said, but maybe I can do something better. So I created Demo Time. So Demo Time is an extension for people that are doing workshops, public speaking, coding demos, or actually making an automation within your project so that you can share it with others and go step by step through your project to learn more and to also see how it works. So you can just create your steps in JSON and saying create a file, open that file, highlight line number 10 to 20, and then you can talk about it during your presentation. You can even create notes. You have a presenter view as well, where you can see all of the information on what kind of steps you still have to do and so on. So nowadays, what I do is I create my presentation with slide dev. I have Demo Time, and I hook them up with each other so I can go from a slide to my demo back to the slide. So, and I can just only use a clicker and all of the code gets generated on the fly. So looks like magic. It feels like you're watching a recording, but actually you're doing it live. So that's pretty cool. So I think that are the two projects that I want to highlight. Beside that, you can always go to my blog to find more information there.
I think this is very interesting. Yeah, I'm going to see if I have time to try out extensions. It's one of those things that has been on my list for a really long time. Hopefully one day I can strike it out.
Cool. So thank you so much, Elio. It was nice speaking to you. And thanks again for talking about VS Code extension, a very interesting topic. And I know when I reached out, you recommended some more topics. So we would love to have you again back on the show, probably talking about the other topics we spoke about. And so meanwhile, till the time, probably I'll see you somewhere soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. See you next time.
Thank you for joining, Sonu. And probably see you for the next episode as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone.